Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start on the final lighting for the palace. And I've noticed that the shadow quality isn't quite dark enough, so I'm going to darken it down on one of the instance lights. It'll change all the other lights. And through the render we should get deeper, darker shadows, darker values in all the recesses, little bit better definition for the model. Turn off the sunlight and we can see the effect of just the ambient lights everywhere. So in this area here, we can see there's a hard shadow coming from one of the lights in the dome. So the idea is to soften the shadow, or at least make it less noticeable. So what I'm going to do is duplicate the dome, place a light in between each of the lights that we had there previously, and just manually disperse them so that they're a little more equal, so we don't have them paired up. Doesn't really matter, we can just eyeball things into place. And we'll render it out. Notice everything got a lot brighter, obviously, because we doubled the amount of lights. So we'll tone down the multiplier, the intensity of the light, back to half, since we doubled them. And then I'm just going to change around some of the positions. Instead of having all the lights in the exact same rows, I'm going to take half the lights and move them down. And that'll just give us softer shadows overall. So now we can see the area where we had the hard shadow. It's a lot softer. There's a few harder lines, but when we turn the sunlight back on, that'll pretty much disappear. And really, right now I'm just looking for a lighting scenario that'll give us a good impression. Something that mimics a kind of ambient occlusion or like a kind of global illumination effect. Of course, we're not getting bounce light here, but that's something that I'll create a similar bounce light pass for one of the towers so that you can see how that's done. So we got the sunlight pass back on. And let's get on to adding a little detail. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to add some simple geometry that'll mimic windows. Some of the structures are still pretty plain, so we do need to have some type of windows on them. Right now they're just brick walls with red rooftops. So if we add these planes that are shaped like windows and position them so that they're floating just atop the wall, just on the outside of the wall. We're not going to bother cutting into the wall or performing Boolean operations. We don't really need that type of detail here. This particular building I know is going to be kind of hiding in the shadows, and in other instances, later on I'll jump ahead to putting these windows all over the other domes. In other instances, they'll be covered by trees and whatnot. So we'll just create an array. You've seen me do this many times. And the great thing about this is in Photoshop, after these windows are placed, we'll have a nice grid on a cylinder that'll show us where the window positions would be. So if we do want to paint over it and touch it up, we can certainly do that without guessing as to what the proper perspective on a cylinder would look. So here we go. We jumped ahead to putting the windows on all these other little domes, some of which I said are going to be covered by trees. Now we got the ground plane in here, and what I'm going to do is apply a matte shadow material. And in Max you can apply a material that will disappear, but it'll still catch shadows. So I applied that matte material to the ground plane, and in return the ground plane is going to essentially hide everything, hide every part every part of the palace below it, below the ground plane. So with the sunlight off, I'm just going to save this file as my ambient pass, and I'll come back to the ambient lights, turn them off, and have the sunlight on, render this out. This will be my sunlight pass, with the alpha channels, of course. Now, I saved the max model here as a gray model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a gray shader and apply it to the entire max model. So all of my brick texture maps and the red roof texture maps will disappear. And we'll just have a gray palace rendered out. And this will allow me to create other render passes. So here's another key light pass, or sunlight pass. This gives me different opportunities to use the lighting values in Photoshop later on. And again, I'll reverse the lighting scenario, and we have a different ambient pass. This time it's all textureless. And then we'll go on to the fog passes. I'll show you how I set up a fog scenario, a fog pass. Basically, I'm just going to create two little cubes, put one far away and one close. The farthest point is going to be, the farthest position for the cube is going to be the farthest point of the palace, and the closer one is going to be the closest position of the palace. With simply two cubes on a plane, it allows me to render fog tests really quickly. What I'm trying to achieve here is I want to find some fog settings that are going to let me see both the cubes, basically just enough so that the cube in the rear, the farthest cube away, is going to look as much fogged out as I can get it, and then the closer cube to be less fogged out, significantly less fogged out. So I'm setting my near and far range for my environment ranges within my camera, and this limits the fog range for the environment setting. Okay, so we're going to go into the environment settings and add a fog effect. And for every scene, you're going to find that the fog effects, the values, the numbers you're putting in for fog, is going to change as per your goal and the scale of the model. So I'll continue to make tweaks until we can see the closer cube clearer than the farther cube, the further cube. And that'll do it. So I'll just hide the cubes and jump ahead to the palace rendering. In the palace rendering, you'll notice that I did two fog passes, one with deeper shadows and a second with flatter shadows. The flatter shadows are achieved by simply putting a black or a dark shader on the model instead of that gray shader that we had earlier. So we have the handrails here, and I know in Photoshop I'm going to want to have control over those handrails, but I don't want to have to trace them out. Since I have them in here as a CG model, I'm going to isolate the handrails, and I'm going to apply a matte material to them, just as I did earlier with the ground plane. Matte materials are quite powerful. They allow you to create alpha channels for objects in your scene, but instead of just simply rendering out these objects here and having the alpha channels that come with them, the matte shadow material is going to allow us to have the rendering of the handrail in connection with its relationship to the domes and the architecture around it. So if we go into the shader, You can change the values of the shader. You can change the opaque alpha, make it transparent. You can make it receive shadows or not. I encourage you to just play around with the shader, explore it, and see what you can come up with, and it'll help you a great deal in your matte paintings. So in the final render of this, we'll see the handrail at the top of the frame has a line through it. That's going to be the line of the dome right here. And so now I don't have to spend any time tracing out this handrail in Photoshop.